Welcome to the Classroom Narratives Healing and Education podcast, the space where education meets resilience. I'm Dr. Joey Weisler, and in each episode, we dive deep into the personal stories of educators, students, leaders, and frontline advocates who are navigating the complexities within modern education. Whether you're just starting your teaching journey or are a seasoned professional looking for inspiration, we'll explore how to foster meaningful change, prevent burnout, and build trauma-informed communities within our schools. Now, let's take a seat at the front of the classroom as we get started. Welcome back to the show, and today on the Classroom Narratives podcast, I welcome Dr. Andrea Mata, otherwise known as Dr. Dre, a clinical child psychologist, parenting expert, and the founder of Bright Spot Families. With years of experience in both academia and in the field, Dr. Mata is on a mission to help parents raise adaptable, emotionally healthy children amidst a growing youth mental health crisis. And she's also the author of the #2 parenting book, Practical Tips for the Pooped Out Parents, which I just read cover to cover this week. And as she says, it is a text that you can read within a very quick couple of sittings, if you will. And Dr. J will talk to us more about that. And whether you're a new teacher, a future parent, or just trying to understand young minds adapt and grow, this conversation is going to serve itself to be filled with impact and insight. So Dr. Dre, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation, Joey.
This is going to be wonderful. And my first question is because when we met through Phil Januszewski's Positive Growth Line, so another shout out to Phil, who has pretty much networked me with about a month's worth of podcast guests in itself, you mentioned your transition from a professor into a psychologist. So I call it from the P to the P, professor to psychologist, running their practice. And as one professor myself, tell us about that switch and what was it like making that career transition?
Yeah, so it was interesting because I had been a college professor for 9 years. I was tenured and promoted. And if you don't know what that means, it's a job that you could never be fired from unless you did something like really, really dumb. I was like super well liked. So, college professor for 9 years, you're like, why would you ever leave if you could never be fired and you were well
Yeah,
liked?
seriously.
Like most people, like when they know what tenure is, they're like, wait, you quit? Like you
Yeah, I'm sitting
resigned? And
here
I was
thinking
like,
that my mouth is like to the floor.
and so it was crazy because in my last year as a college professor, I was being pursued by a large company to be their marriage and parenting personality. And throughout the interview process, at one point, they like pulled me to the side and they're like, hey, do you realize with your training, your knowledge, your credentials, your expertise, your personality, you could have a much bigger impact and make a lot more money not being a college professor compared like not being a college professor. And I was like, really? And I was like, okay, I think it's time for me to kind of step away. And so that's when I joined a private practice because I had a private practice before, but then I joined a larger one because I hate billing. Paperwork is like the bane of my existence. And so I've been doing that since I resigned in February of 2021. I finished up the semester and then I started at that private practice doing therapy with individuals, couples, and families since June of 2021.
Wow, thank you for that. So I just completed reading the #2 parenting book, which is an excellent read for anybody who is in a scenario where they're in the presence of authority, of people of any age under, let's say, the age of 20, really.
Yeah.
And the #2 parenting book shows that presence and consistency are two main parenting hacks. And first of all, Dr. Trey, I wanted you to tell us a little bit about this book and what your inspiration was to create it. And then mention, if you would, how some of the behaviors of, let's say, again, presence and consistency really translate into how teachers can effectively manage a classroom and try and mediate student behavior.
Yeah. So how the book started was actually when I was a college professor. I taught a class called Applied Sports Psychology, and this is actually the first chapter in the book.
Yes.
And it was actually co-taught by our head swimming and diving coach. And I remember we started teaching it, and it was a highly popular class. I remember the first year we taught it, we gave a textbook. And the co-teacher got up because I asked a question on the very first day of like actual lectures. And finally, the co-teacher stood up and he's like, did any of you guys read? And they're all like, no. because college students don't read
No.
textbooks. Textbooks are boring, they're too long, they're too academic. And so we're like, okay, then the second semester we did a book and they liked it better, but they still weren't that big of fans of it. And we're like, okay, we hear you. So then the third semester that we taught it, we ended up going with this book and it was called The Mind Gym, and it was short chapters. And coach, that's what I called him, coach got up on the first day of class when I was going through syllabus day and he's like, you all, there is no excuses for you not reading because you can literally read this book in the time it takes you to poop. And then when I was working on like writing this parenting book, I'm like, okay, what is it going to make my book stand out compared to the other parenting book? And I started like just brain dumping a bunch of stuff. And then it hit me and I was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to write practical parenting tips in chapters so that they can read them in the time that it took someone to poop. And so I did all of the research on like how long should it actually take us to poop? And guess what? It's actually only a minute, but you should not be sitting on the toilet for longer than 5 minutes. So each of the chapters can be read in under 5 minutes. And I usually say 5 to 7 minutes just to kind of save my hiney. I have this phrase where I talk about we want to parent, we want to teach, we want to be business leaders by setting high expectations within the context of the warm and fuzzies. And so I break the chapter, the sections. The first one is like the fundamentals of all parenting. So if you're not doing anything else, do these things. And one of them is consistency. And I had this just this week with one of my clients, and we were talking about like how their parent is inconsistent. Like you're going to be there one day and do something, and then the next day you're a little bit more lackadaisical. And I was talking to the parent, he's also a college professor. And I was like, look, if you go to the chair of your department and you ask him for something and he completely blows you off and like blows up on you, you're going to be like, oh. And then the next day you go in and you ask him for something else and he's like super kind and like helpful. You're going to have no idea as like how to proceed because us as human beings love consistency. So that's the number one tip that I talk a lot about is as a teacher, as a parent, as a boss, the more consistent that you can be, the better off it is. We're humans. We're going to have days where we're going to kind of veer off from that, but there should be like a relatively consistent range. And if there's days that you're having a bad day, well, then like communicate that with your kids, your students, with your employees. Like, hey, I'm just having a crap day today. So, like, if I seem a little off, like, that's what's going on. And I think you prepare them to be like, okay, this is why he's acting different. And they're not left guessing.
Right. And you also talk about presence because, again,
Mm,
being a parent or being a teacher is not that spectator sport. And being a
mhm,
student is also not a spectator sport. I tell my students all the time if you want to succeed, be present, show
mhm.
up, join the conversation. What are some different ways that educators can be consistent in managing their classroom behaviors and still communicate those expectations from day one to day 180?
Yeah. So let's go back to presence real quick. So presence is huge because I always talk about if you want to succeed in anything that you are doing, the number one thing you have to do is show up. I think if for teachers, and I know like teachers, especially like K through 12, like sometimes when that bell rings at 3 o'clock or whatever, you want to get out the door. But if you can stay around a little bit longer or show up to some of the events or have special time or office hours, college professors like show up for your office hours and be present, or come 10 minutes before your class starts and stay, be willing to stay for 5 to 10 minutes after your class ends, and just be that presence and show up. You have no idea, and like show interest in people so that when you're there for that 10 minutes before class starts, you're not just shuffling things, like you're interacting with your class, you're having conversations with them, you're not just on your phone prepping, but like you're engaged, you're showing up, you have that presence. The same thing goes with parents. That dad that I was talking about earlier this week, he his kid had a pretty big escalation in the last week, and it became very conflictual, and it all stemmed from his dad being on his phone. And so it caused a lot of problems, and it was like, you need to be present. And even if you guys are watching TV, don't be on your phone, because your kids believe like, oh, we're having time with dad, we're watching a show with him. That's what they're expecting, that's what they envision, that's their image in their mind. And then if you're over here on your phone, like, you're not actually engaging with them at all. And so I think it's having that consistent behavior, that consistent presence, where they know that when they show up for class. That's another question that I always ask the TAs. I would be like, what makes you reinforcing? Why should students want to get up at 8 a.m. and come to your class? What is it going to be about you as a professor that's going to make them want to come? Because if you're just up there and you're like Charlie Brown's teacher, like, "Mur, mur, 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 mur," like, no one's going to want to come up. So you have to, and yes, it's like kind of exhausting, because you're like, I don't want to be an entertainer, but to some extent, you have to have an entertainment value, because you have to be reinforcing. So presence, and then once you can conquer presence, once you can up it to some kind of entertainment value, you don't have to be a comedian or something like that, but it has to be reinforcing. It has to be fun.
Absolutely. And it lets me think that, like, even as educators, when we are present for our students before the bell, after the bell, greeting them at the door, having
Hmm.
small conversations and focusing on what we call to be the micro moments when they come in,
Hmm.
which are just conversations to help build partnerships, right?
Hmm.
Like, my students this semester are following me on my LinkedIn profile for business communication and networking. So when they come in and be like, oh, saw you got that internship, congratulations, tell me more about it. And
Hmm.
you talked about the relationship bank model as well, right?
Hmm.
When we invest into our students' well-being and show that we care about them as people, I think the outcomes are stronger because they see us as a human who really wants to invest in their success, most importantly.
One of the things that I would do to kind of build those relationships with my students as a professor was, on the first day of syllabus day, I would always have an index card.
Mhm.
And on the index card, they would always write down like their name. And I would always tell them, write down if you have a nickname, whatever you want me to call you by. But I would warn them, like, whatever you want, like, whatever you put down is forever what Dr. Mata will call you. And they're like, okay. And so one guy literally put like coyote, and so even now, as he's like a chiropractor, he'll send me emails and I'll be like, Coyote, how are you doing? And he's like, I'm doing great, Dr. Mata. And so on that card, so like, not only would they put their name, they'd put their year, they would put down what their major was and their minor. I'd ask them like, why are you taking this class? And I tell them to be honest, like, you're not going to hurt my feelings if you're just taking this class because it's required, but put that down. A question that they would like to have answered throughout the semester. And then I would actually, like, on the first day, I would list out all their questions and then put them across the semester in my planning to make sure that I answered all of the questions throughout the semester. And then the last thing was a fun fact. So, like, something interesting, something that they were okay with me knowing and like bringing up in the middle of class. I think like having that index card allows you to have that relationship with your students. And then that also makes it super enjoyable and reinforcing, because then you're having a conversation then with your students instead of just talking at them. You can
Right.
have conversations with them.
Exactly. So I kind of do the same thing as well. And when it comes to icebreakers, I've had plenty of classes where you go around the room one by one and say your name and your major and your favorite food. That's lovely.
Yeah.
But for my icebreakers, I have the students get up, they're actually
Hmm.
interacting somehow. We do all these different types of games that require their movement. We
Hmm.
always do that on day one. And then we do it again on the last day of class.
That's awesome.
Once they've all known each other, we redo it as if it was the
Hmm.
first day all over again. And throughout the semester, I too also try and get to know their names as quickly as I can. Like, when they have their pictures available through the, I don't know, like the instructor platform or
Mm-hmm.
whatnot, I study that, not to be a creep, but I just study that for days and days before the semester begins so I can match their face with their names
Hmm.
when they walk through my door for the first time. And what it's taught me is that, especially when you then start to build, for me, is like community circles and having everybody sit in a circle so they can look at each other. And instead of having lecture, we actually do just have daily discussion. I think the
Hmm.
most important way to continue having that presence and consistency is to not just build partnerships with the students, but really strive to get the students to form partnerships with each other.
Hmm.
And I think when the classroom community flourishes because everybody is there to be on the same field as everybody, the whole climate will really start to thrive in that sense. And it makes them feel safe as well.
Yeah, so one of my favorite class when I was at the university, it was a class that I created, Dating in the 21st Century. And it was all discussion based, and there was always more students in it than we were actually supposed to have, because like all the women would like flock to it and fill it up, and I was like, I can't teach a dating class without any men. And so then I would have to add in men. And I remember the first time that I taught it, there was like 15 women and 7 men. And they created the men all on their own, because we did like it was a long circle. And the men on their own created guys' corner. So all the guys sat in one corner of the circle so that they could provide support to each other. But I routinely got on course evaluations as that was the best course the students had ever taken, because they were expected to read some kind like an empirical article or from a book or something. And then they were supposed to come in, and then there would be 2 people that would like, or one person would lead the discussion for that day. So a classmate would lead a conversation and ask questions. And the one rule for the class that I kind of established at the very beginning was like, you are allowed to say whatever it is that you want to say in this class,
Mhm.
and no one can tell you that they're offended by to shut you down. If you are offended, you have to sit back, and the onus and responsibility is on you to figure out like, why are you offended by what that person just said? And then you're supposed to ask questions to
Mhm.
that person to have a conversation. So if you can't do that, this class is not for you. But I
Mhm.
never had anyone drop it, and we had really good conversations in there. And it never got heated, because everyone was really wanting to learn why people were thinking and why people had experiences and why they had opinions. And it was just this amazing class, because students, we actually felt safe to discuss things, because no matter what, we couldn't be attacked.
My very first semester in 2020, my chair came to me and he said, okay, your job is to go in there and lecture. People are paying because you are the expert. They want to hear you lecture. And I'm like, yeah, are they really? Are they really? Like, you can't lead me to believe that. Seriously?
Right. Hmm.
And I agree, like, even at the graduate level, even if students are looking at Dr. Weisler, who is like this all-knowing, no, I'm not. And I
Right.
always like to emphasize to students, and I'm talking here to all levels, even from K to 12. You might not see it. I mean, okay, elementary school, this might be less applicable, but I really do
Hmm.
like to see all of our educators at the same, not cognitive, of course, but the same thought level as their students, meaning that we're all equals. There's not one person who's over here with everybody else
Hmm.
down there. We're all just humans living a human experience. And I think the classroom's a place where we can validate that.
Hmm.
So when you talk about that group conversation, I love that, because I think when we allow everybody to be part of the conversation, again, even in middle school and high school, when you let those students focus on their people skills, that goes into the intentional learning where they can get the outcomes by socializing with each other and having those conversations to maximize whatever discourse is trying to happen in that
Hmm.
space. So it leads me to think about when it comes to just children and students working through all different types of struggles and events. One thing that really grabs my attention when you spoke with us on Phil's podcast is that you mentioned that there are differences that you have with trauma-informed programs in schools. And I definitely wanted to learn all about that, because on the classroom narratives and in my
Hmm.
dissertation, that's what I try and analyze. And now I admit I just wrote a whole dissertation, 300 pages on trauma-informed ed. And I'm still looking at this like, okay, but what does it do? So I want to bring in
Hmm.
another expert as you and tell us about that. And when it comes to trauma-informed ed and classrooms as well, what are some misconceptions that we have for children and even educators in terms of emotional adaptability?
Yeah, so I would love to have a conversation about this, because from here's my story of the first time that I heard about trauma informed ed was I was wanting to partner with a local middle school, And what I was offering the principal was I was going to train my undergrad psych majors to go into these schools and run these coping skills groups. And so I met with the principal. We sat down and we're like talking, and I'm like telling her what I want to do. And she looks at me and goes, well, and keep in mind, this is back in like 2014, 2015,
Oh,
something
wow.
like that. So this is like 10, 11 years ago.
Before its time.
And
Yeah.
hmm and so when it first started coming out, and she looked at me and she's like, "Oh, well, we're a trauma-informed school." And I had never heard it before. And I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, okay." And she's like, "Do you know what that means?" And I was like, "No." I'm like, "Please tell me, educate me." And she's like, "Okay." I still remember the exact example she gave me. She's like, "So if an eighth grader tells the bus driver to F off, we are not going to give him a consequence because we're just going to assume that he witnessed his dad like shoot up the night before. And that's why he's like on edge. And that's why he told the bus driver to F off." And I remember just sitting back and being like, because I had just come off of my internship for clinical psychology to get my PhD. I had to do a year internship somewhere in the United States. I did mine at a place called Boys Town, which is a residential treatment facility, and it's a heavy behavioral program. So we focus on behaviors. We don't really pay attention to thoughts. We don't really pay attention to emotions. It's all about the behaviors. And I'm just thinking about this from like a behavioral standpoint. I was like, but I mean, I get it, but at the same time, like there still needs to be a consequence for that behavior. And so then obviously we did not partner. And so now that I've just kind of, as I'm hearing more and more trauma informed ed come out, it really I hesitate a little bit about it in schools, or not a little bit, a lot, is because of the focus on feelings. Because when I teach my clients, I like teach them the psychology triangle, that our psychology is made up of three things. It's made up of our thoughts, our behaviors, and our feelings. And there's one of those that we have absolutely no control over, and it's our emotions, that's our feelings. And or if we're focusing as teachers, as educators, as principals, as authority figures, if we're as parents, if we're focusing solely on their feelings, they have no control over it. And really, emotions and our feelings are just signals to what is going on in our environment. And we still need to teach them how to challenge those thoughts that are making them feel a certain kind of way. And they still should be expected to behave in line with the expectations, regardless of what their feelings are. Because when they become adults, they can't go into the workforce and be like, "Hey, I don't really feel like doing this today. Like, that's my feeling, that's my truth, and so I'm just not gonna do it today." Like, the boss would be like, "Okay, you're fired." And it is happening. Like, I think it's 61% of businesses in America have fired a Gen Z employee within the first few months of hiring them because of a variety of reasons.
So is trauma informed synonymous to behavioral problems or behavioral circumstances that exist in the school's climate as you've seen it?
I think when I hear trauma informed education, it always makes me think of, I remember there would be workshops that I would hear about, and it would be like, all children have trauma. And I'd pause and be like, not all children have trauma, because I think of trauma from like the DSM, the manual that we use to diagnose things.
Right.
Trauma is very specific. So, like, you've been sexually assaulted, you have been injured, or your life was in jeopardy, or you witnessed any of those three things. Like, that's my version, that's my definition of trauma. And I think we've experienced a lot of concept creep. Like, we've kind of expanded out what the definition of trauma to include stressful life events and adverse childhood experiences. And I don't think that concept creep of kind of everything is trauma, and then we have big T and little t, I don't
Mhm.
think that's serving our youth very well.
Yeah, I have a few guests on the podcast that would agree with you that the word trauma has become a little bit more trivial in some
Hmm.
respects. So, would you say that trauma informed education is not talking about trauma or bringing up trauma with students, but rather just focusing on their social skills to maneuver a productive human experience?
From my experience, I think it's much more like the trauma informed is much more about like their emotional reactions to situations. And I think the other issue that I have with trauma informed is that I don't think it's the intent, but it does convey to our students that they are broken, that our
Mm.
youth are broken. And I don't want our youth to have that view of themselves, because then self fulfilling prophecy comes in. It's like, well, if these authority figures, if these teachers and my parents and all these people that are smart people say that I'm broken or that I'm traumatized, well, then I'm going to start acting in ways that broken people act. And we're going to start acting in ways that traumatized people act. And I don't think that's the case.
So then, in thinking of those respects, so what are some misconceptions that we then have about trauma-informed education that we can help our students in terms of being more emotionally adept?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that I teach my clients is I teach them like, hey, let's understand your emotions. And so I do a series of activities with them. I first teach them about the psychology triangle, and then the second step is I teach them about emotions. And like, okay, list out 6 emotions. And then, okay, how do we know when someone is experiencing those emotions? What do they look like? How do they sound? How do they move? How do they carry themselves? And so I ask them all of those things. And then we figure out, okay, what emotion are we trying to understand specifically for you? Is it anxiety? Is it anger? Is it frustration? Is it stressed? And I'm like, okay, that's the emotion we want to focus on. We want to focus on anxiety. Awesome. Okay, then pick mom or dad, pick one of your siblings, and then pick your best friend. How does that specific person experience those emotions? And then once we figured that out, then I asked them, okay, how does your body tell you that you are anxious? What does your body do? What does your mind do? And then we talk about emotion regulation and how when something happens, our emotions are going to go up, 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 up. They're going to peak. And sometimes they're going to volcano out. And then they're naturally going to come down. And from the time that something happens to the time that like our emotions naturally come down, it's about 10 to 20 minutes. And so our goal is to like not do anything kind of unhelpful or unproductive at that peak. And so then we talk about like their anxiety buildup. So as they go up, what is their body doing? So like the other day I had a client like I get shaky, I get mad, I think about all of the bad things that have happened to me, and then I yell, and then I start doing all this other stuff. And so then we get to start to see like, okay, when you start to shake, do you shake any other time? And she's like, no. Well, then that's the first sign that you are starting to be anxious or angry, frustrated, stressed. And so, like, we want to try to figure out reasonable, socially appropriate ways for you to regulate your emotions. And so then we're like, okay, then we got into like the fight, flight, freeze cycle. And we talked about like completing the cycle. And so hers is like fight. And I was like, okay, well, what are some socially appropriate ways for you to complete your fight cycle that doesn't involve you yelling at people? And I was like, okay, well, like what mimics fighting? Push-ups mimic fighting, and like doing kickboxing, like shadow boxing, doing what else? Like slam balls mimics fighting. And so like try to do those things to see whether or not you can remove yourself or stop yourself from going into that escalation. And so I think it's those kind of things that we want to be teaching our students, that how to regulate their emotions in a good, effective way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And what would you consider to be some of the most important tips from the Number Two Parenting book that teachers can use in their classrooms as well? And what would you say would be to be like the secret ingredient for the secret sauce and being able to thrive in education? What would that look like as well?
Okay, top tips. So I'll pull, well, we already talked about consistency, so I won't talk about consistency again, but I will talk, and this kind of answers your second question, Joey. Adapt. So there's a chapter in the book called Adapt, Adapt, Adapt. And so I am all about raising and building adaptable youth. And what that means is I want to teach youth and Gen Z to have enough individual skills, relationship skills, coping skills, so that regardless of what environment they go into, they can sit back, they can assess, and then they can pull skills out of their toolbox and they can thrive in any environment that they go in. So whether that's relationship skills, coping skills, individual skills like managing their own emotions, those kind of things. And so there's a chapter in the book about adapting. How do we problem solve on the spot? How do we assess the situation? How do we come up with solutions to the problem? And then how do we execute it? So I think that's one. I think another tip would be for in the book is like why kids do what they do. So figuring out like the four functions of children's behavior. So are they doing things because of attention? Are they doing things because they're trying to get out of something? So escape and avoidance. Are they doing things because they're getting something out of it, something tangible? Or are they doing stuff because it feels good? And that is by far the most frustrating for parents and teachers because you look at them and you're like, why did you do that? And they're like, because I wanted to. And the teacher's like, that's not a good enough excuse. And the kid's like, I wanted to. And like a lot of the times I'll look at parents and the parents are like, answer me. And I'm like, they did answer you. And
Yeah,
they're like, no, they
that's the
didn't. And
answer.
I'm like,
Yeah.
that's literally the answer. And they're like, but that's so frustrating. I'm like, I get it, but that's the answer. And then the last one in the book that I talk about is the 5-to-1 ratio. So I steal this from Dr. John Gottman. He's a leading expert in marriage, and he can predict by watching a couple for 5 minutes, he can predict with like a 95% accuracy whether or not the couple will get a divorce. And it's the 5-to-1 positive to negative ratio. So for every one negative interaction that you have with a child or a student, there's then 5 positive interactions that you have to have with that student in order to make up for things. And that seems exhausting. But when I used to also teach a workshop to new faculty coming in at the university that I was at, was on like building relationships. And so I would tell them, I was like, hey, whenever you feel like sending like a nasty email to your students, don't. Because for every nasty email that you send to your students, there's 5 like positive things that you need to do for them or with them in order to get that relationship back on like good footing. So I think that's probably the other tip that I would give.
Thank you so much for that. That's definitely helpful for our teachers to hear as well. And what are some ways that our listeners can get in touch with you?
So my website, so Andrea at brightspotfamilies.com is my email. My website is brightspotfamilies.com. And then I'm very active on LinkedIn. So it's just Andrea Mata, PhD.
Perfect. We'll have that available in the show notes as well. So that was Dr. Andrea Mata reminding us that behind every resilient child is a community of informed adults, which include us as educators as well. So be sure to check out the #2 parenting book. And if today's episode resonated with you, share it with a fellow educator, parent, or even student teacher. And as always, keep showing up for both yourself and your students. We'll see you next time here in the Classroom Narratives podcast. Thank you for joining us on the Classroom Narratives Healing and Education podcast. If today's episode inspired you or made you think differently, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment or review wherever you listen to podcasts and stay connected with us on the @Classroom Narratives podcast over Instagram and Facebook. Remember, together we can transform our scars into stars in education, one conversation at a time.